crises
I
and
am
so
tired
forth.
of the abusive fathers. I'm tired of the mayhem. The filmmakers of this generation are apparently some of the most unhappy people on planet Earth.
Well, this could be a much more interesting movie, it seems to me, if it had just stayed with the subject. When it was just the two of them and the mystery of his blindness, then the movie worked. As, for example, when he's in the room and he can tell what the shape of the room is by listening to the rain on the roof.
I just don't want to hear how miserable he is when he's able to do that kind of massage and get it.
Well, what about his clients? They're pretty happy, too. Okay.
On January 23, 1999, Gene Siskel, who along with Roger Ebert constituted one half of the legendary Chicago duo who revolutionized and popularized the art of film criticism with their brilliantly simple thumbs-up, thumbs-down assessments, sat down with Roger for another episode of their popular television show. The slate was typical Siskel and Ebert fare, a weepy romantic drama starring Val Kilmer and Mira Sorvino, a James Woods crime drama starring James Woods and Melanie Griffith, a Woody Harrelson Western, a disappointing dramedy with an all-star cast featuring Angelina Jolie and Sean Connery, and a breezy British comedy starring Helena Bonham Carter and Kenneth Branagh. As usual, the critics agreed on a couple of movies and voiced their differences on the others, playfully sniping at each other's taste and sparring over whether each flick deserved the coveted thumbs up. There was nothing particularly special about the episode, aside from the fact that it would be the last time the two men sat in an empty theater in front of cameras to tell us what movies were worth plunking down the price of a ticket. Even at the dawn of the new millennium, the world was an entirely different place in 1999. The internet was ascendant, to be sure, but its omnipresence in our daily lives was far from secure at that point. Now, anyone with an iPhone can be a movie critic and develop a sizable following on social media or in the podcast world if they're any good at it. Back in the mid-'70s, when they first started their television show, however, movie criticism was largely the province of highbrow publications like The New Yorker with Pauline Kael's acid-dipped pen, and uncompromising views, helping to shape the opinions of the intelligentsia, or relegated to the back pages of newspapers as an afterthought nearly on par with the classified ads, and only glanced at once people flipped through the headlines and sports sections. But two Chicago critics from rival newspapers squaring off against each other week after week changed everything. Siskel was a fussy intellectual with an Ivy League pedigree and an almost academic approach to movie criticism, while Ebert was more of a hometown hero with a grounded and direct style designed to make film analysis acceptable to a broader audience. Their mutual respect for each other was always there, but it was often buried beneath their long-simmering resentments and a deep-seated rivalry. Siskel and Ebert were fundamentally wired very differently. Siskel relished in his more formal analysis of cinema, unwilling to dumb down criticism for dilettantes wandering into a theater for a brainless summer blockbuster. Ebert was entirely different, willing to find the charm and appeal in lowbrow comedies and steadfastly committed to bringing the everyman into the fold. One thing was clear, however, the dysfunctional pair developed a rapport on camera that audiences absolutely loved. Their show received 7 Primetime Emmy Award nominations for Outstanding Informational Series and took home 3 Daytime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Special Class Series from 1989 to 1991. The duo appeared countless times together on The Tonight Show, The Late Show with David Letterman, and a raft of other talk shows and radio programs. They were fixtures in pop culture, lampooning their public image as the cantankerous, squabbling movie critics on Saturday Night Live, and although they often turned down movie cameos to maintain their independence and professional integrity, they couldn't resist appearing in an episode of the animated television series The Critic, which was about a film critic who hosted a television show. A world without the comfort of turning on the television and watching Siskel and Ebert bicker about the latest film offerings was pretty unfathomable. Even if movies aren't your thing, they were such an important piece of pop culture, sort of like how Alex Trebek became a hugely important celebrity even beyond die-hard trivia fans who tuned into Jeopardy each night. And nobody expected this to be their last episode. Least of all Gene Siskel himself, who announced that he'd be taking a leave of absence from the show on February 3rd to tend to his health after being diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor in May 1998. He'd had a surgery shortly after the diagnosis and had returned to his spot on the show, but his recovery hit a snag in early 1999. Still, Siskel said he expected to be back by the fall, telling fans, quote, "I'm in a hurry to get well because I don't want Roger to get more screen time than I." Just 17 days later, he passed away at a hospital in Evanston, Illinois. Gene Siskel was just 53 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Gene Siskel.
News of Gene Siskel's death sent shockwaves through the entertainment community. Movie critics occupy a strange space in the Hollywood ecosystem. In one sense, their film analysis lends credibility to the art form and helps generate enthusiasm and awareness for the most popular movies. But many Hollywood industry folks are thin-skinned egotists who bristle at snarky jabs from critics behind a keyboard who never produce any art themselves. But Siskel and Ebert really transcended all of that and became part of the entertainment firmament, not because they pulled punches as PR flacks for the industry, but because they were both genuinely respected for their craft and recognized as an important part of the Hollywood industrial complex. This is perhaps best exemplified by Whoopi Goldberg's impromptu tribute to Gene Siskel during her hosting of the 1999 Academy Awards after he was conspicuously absent from the in memoriam package. She said, quote, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone we lost too recently to include in our film tribute. He wasn't a filmmaker, but he definitely was a member of our film community. Now he clobbered some of us with a great big stick, and sometimes he touched us with his velvet glove. I'm talking about Gene Siskel. He was a critic, but more importantly, he really loved movies. So Gene, wherever you are, honey, here's to you." She ended the tribute with the iconic thumbs-up gesture, which elicited rapturous applause from the audience.
There were tributes throughout Hollywood, but everyone in the world was waiting on the response of one man upon hearing the news of Siskel's passing, his longtime partner and fellow movie critic Roger Ebert. Like any good film, there was a bit of dramatic tension built up over exactly how Ebert would respond to the news. Although there was obviously a lucrative professional relationship through various iterations of their television show over the years, fans of Siskel and Ebert also knew about the iciness of their personal relationship at times, as seen during their appearances on late-night television and sniping back and forth in the media. It was part of what crackled and enthralled audiences for so long. Lots of critics can write pithy and even trenchant film analysis, but the interplay between these two titans of the form and their genuinely different temperaments and tastes were the engine of their shared success. But anyone who expected a cold or emotionless statement from Roger Ebert on the passing of Siskel was grossly mistaken. He knew that he'd be asked these types of questions and was ready, delivering genuinely heartfelt interviews like this one on Larry King Live about his friend and colleague in the days after his death.
He had a wonderful spirit, and I think that it was an inspiration to me that for the last 8 or 9 months, he continued to do the show and to do his print work and his other jobs just as if he wasn't sick. I wanted to believe that he would be back because we worked together for 24 years, and it was a relationship that became very important, and it really was a working relationship. We had all kinds of little vibes that we shared with each other, Larry. We kind of knew when the other guy was going to stop talking, or there was a verbal shorthand. We had been through so many movies together and so many experiences together that we could read each other's minds sometimes.
There were no hints of the rancor and competitive jealousies that so often attended their joint appearances. In the wake of his passing, all that was left were the positive memories and the gratitude for the partnership.
Ebert's finest tribute to Siskel came on their television program just a week after he died.
I lost my good friend last week when Gene Siskel passed away. My colleague and sparring partner was only 53 years old when he died from an illness he'd been fighting since last May. Gene continued as long as he could to do the job he loved. On the first few shows after his surgery, he phoned in his reviews from his hospital room. Then he returned here to the set where only a month ago he was seated right there across from me in the balcony reviewing the latest movies. People have asked me why he continued working so long when he was ill, and the answer, I think, is he had a real passion for his job and he thought it was worth doing.
Derek, this is obviously delivered without tears or any obvious emotion. There was something so profoundly sad about seeing Ebert sitting alone in that movie theater during the first episode after Gene's death. They were a part of American fabric at that time, and the fact that he was alone in that theater was profoundly sad.
It was powerful. You know, I always thought of them like, you remember from the Muppets, Waldorf and Statler.
Yeah.
You couldn't have one without the other. Every time they were on late night television, they were together.
Yep.
You booked Siskel and Ebert because you wanted them, you know, sniping at each other on the couch. That was highly entertaining to people. They were also both great film critics in their own right. They would write for their respective publications, but when you tuned in and you saw them on the schedule, you knew you were in for something that was going to be very, very funny.
We started talking before we started filming the pod, and it's really, you know, I was a perfect age, and it definitely seems very analog, right? The two of them sitting in a theater on local television on Saturday afternoons, right. And you would tune in before the days of DVR. You had to catch them, but there was something comforting, informative, fascinating, interesting, all that stuff, really entertaining about the two of them. And a big part of that, to the point you just made, big part of that was their sniping. It got a little mean-spirited sometimes in a couple of the Letterman segments that we talked about, or we're going to talk about, but it got a little uncomfortable. But in the theater themselves, when it was being produced, it was great stuff.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, temperamentally, they couldn't have been more different. We'll talk about it as we talk about their legacies, but, Gene was very fussy and intellectual, and Roger was like a man of the people, salt of the earth. So it was present in every film review they did that they would just sort of have disagreements that bubbled up.
And there was real speculation about how the show would go on without Siskel in the chair right next to Ebert, something Ebert put to rest at the close of the tribute show.
And that was only last April. Now Gene Siskel has left us. The show will go on. We plan to invite a series of guest critics to help review the new movies because I know that's what Gene wanted. He thought the movies deserved to be taken seriously on television. And let's see, what else do I know for sure about Gene? Well, people always asked if we really hated each other. And one thing I know for sure is that we didn't. This is going to come as an enormous surprise to my wife and to everyone else who knows us. But, big guy, I love you.
Indeed, the show would go on in different forms with those guest critics and even spawned a fruitful partnership between Roger Ebert and Gene's successor, Richard Roeper, a film critic from the Chicago Sun-Times who hosted the newly renamed Ebert and Roeper at the Movies with Roger from 2000 to 2008. Of course, it was never the same without Gene and Roger. This is no knock on Richard Roeper, who amiably sparred with Roger and tried to keep the magic alive, but the public's fascination was truly with the dynamic between Siskel and Ebert, which couldn't be replicated. I actually liked Roeper when he came along.
He's a lovely guy.
It was sort of like when Drew Carey replaced Bob Barker. You didn't want to like it as much as he did, but Roeper came along. He was pretty good.
And they had a successful run. 8 years is no slouch. It's sort of like the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. No one ever thought his shoes could be filled, but Jay Leno had a very successful run.
Maybe it wasn't Carson, and the older folks look back with longing towards the days of Carson. But Roeper was pretty good. Obviously, then they started by the late decade of the 2000s, getting to a point where the internet was now challenging them, and they just couldn't keep up with it.
It's exactly right. To remember Gene Siskel most for his spontaneous arguments in the studio with Roger Ebert or his simple thumbs up, thumbs down signal for a movie's quality would be a great disservice. Before he ever sat in front of a camera, Gene Siskel sat behind a keyboard, busily cranking out movie reviews for the venerable Chicago Tribune. Siskel was a brilliant guy, graduating from Yale with a degree in philosophy in 1967 and studying under Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist John Hersey, who helped him land the job at the Tribune in 1969. He served as the newspaper's film critic for the first 16 years of his career, building a reputation as cerebral and unsparing, although not mean-spirited. He had high expectations for film and delighted when they were made well, but he was unafraid to dole out harsh critiques when he felt something didn't work or fell into gimmickry unworthy of the art form. He was resolute that film criticism should be informed by personal tastes and not swayed by public opinion, and few could quibble with his specific, albeit somewhat esoteric taste in films like the contemplative and experimental philosophical exercise My Dinner with Andre, the Holocaust documentary Shoah, and the hilarious Kubrick send-up of wartime anxieties during the nuclear age, Dr. Strangelove. But he wasn't pretentious and had a fondness for popular movies like the sweat-soaked disco classic Saturday Night Fever, and often remarked that his childhood favorite, Dumbo, had a huge influence on him. That said, he often gave negative reviews to films that became blockbusters at the box office, including Poltergeist, Scarface, Beverly Hills Cop, The Terminator, Aliens, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Thelma and Louise, and even Best Picture winners like Silence of the Lambs and Unforgiven. These weren't misses for Gene, although a lot of people point to the movies that he criticized. It's sort of an art form in itself on the internet to say Gene Siskel missed the boat here. He didn't see it that way, and he rarely backed off of a review after learning of the film's success. You would sort of try to say, gotcha, look how good Silence of the Lambs was. He's like, no, I didn't enjoy it.
Right. You and I like a podcast called Rewatchables.
Yes.
And they have, as part of, they review old movies, and as part of that, they always say, what did Roger have to say about it?
That's right.
And when he dislikes a movie they like, they just can't understand it because they have so much respect for him, but they're like, hey, difference of opinion happens, I guess.
Yeah, can't account for taste.
That's right. Although he'd already built a reputation in Chicago, his big break would come when he teamed up with another hotshot film critic from the rival Chicago Sun-Times named Roger Ebert. The two hosted a local show on Chicago's PBS affiliate that would eventually become their iconic and nationally syndicated Sneak Previews program. There was a beauty in the simplicity of their trademark thumbs up, thumbs down system that made film criticism instantly accessible to the masses. They didn't dumb down the reviews, which were still nuanced and thoughtful, but the gesture distilled the review into a simple endorsement or rejection of its quality for people who just wanted to hear the bottom line.
Jason, I have a question. What do you think? What's your take on the thumbs up, thumbs down? Because it's obviously iconic. That's undeniable. But a lot of people think it actually is sort of silly and demeaning to movies to distill them down to a thumbs up, thumbs down. They brought movies to the masses, but a lot of critics say you actually destroyed what is an art form.
I honestly appreciate the question. I cannot give you an objective answer. It was such a part of my childhood, and I enjoyed it so much, and it is now part of our vernacular when we talk about movies.
Right.
And the vernacular of movies generally is thumbs up, thumbs down. I would, I don't give movies a rating of 1 to 10. So in my mind, it's perfect.
Yeah.
I loved it. And it's a perfect distillation of whether you liked a movie or didn't like a movie. It doesn't require additional commentary.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's not the right thing. Maybe it's beneath their stature as film critics. Maybe it's beneath Gene Siskel's stature as an Ivy League educated philosopher.
Right.
But for me, it's perfect.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, it takes away the eggheadedness. If you want the analysis, go ahead and read film books, read the full reviews. But at the end of the day, I would just look for that thumb.
But to talk about Siskel and Ebert only through their long-running television program would largely miss the point. At their peak, they were a pop culture institution, appearing frequently on late-night talk shows, making cameos on SNL, and even popping up on children's shows like Sesame Street. During his life, they appeared on The Tonight Show 26 times, The Late Show with David Letterman another 15 times, and Oprah Winfrey's Show 3 times, and countless others. And you can see why. Just type in Siskel and Ebert Tonight Show clips on YouTube, and you'll get a bunch of gems, showing their easy rapport with the host and the simmering resentments between the professional rivals. They handled most of them with good humor, but you could always tell there was an element of real hostility just beneath the camaraderie that made them compelling television. Just listen to this clip from an appearance with Jay Leno when the two men lightly bickered about how best to order their names after they were honored with a Chicago street.
A good name for the street would be Ebert and Siskel Street.
That would be an interesting way to go. But how did it go, Siskel and Ebert? Because alphabetically, you...
Well, there was a flip a long time ago, and it was supposed to be Siskel and Ebert for 2 years, and then Ebert and Siskel for 2 years, but somehow the second 2 years we're still waiting for, so I think at least I should get the street.
I think what Roger's fear is that people will shorten it. They'll just remember the first name will become Siskel Way. And that happened out here in Los Angeles. It used to be called Laurel and Hardy Canyon Boulevard, and now it's Laurel Canyon Boulevard.
Was that really Laurel and Hardy? Oh, I didn't know that. I had no idea.
And everyone leaned in on the rivalry, famously culminating in their appearance on The Late Show starring Joan Rivers, who conducted a, quote, together and separately interview with the two men wearing headphones with loud music to block their ability to hear the things said by the other. When asked what he considered the biggest difference between himself and Ebert, Siskel didn't hesitate at all and replied, quote, I'm a better reviewer than he is. He was vicious. They were sort of like, it was acid-dipped pen just live on television. You would watch these things, they would say vicious things to each other.
There was a moment I remember, and it was awful, and I believe they were on Letterman, and Siskel had been bald since he was in his 30s, and Ebert struggled with his weight forever.
Yes.
And Siskel kind of went in on Ebert's weight. And Ebert responded with, well, I'm trying to lose the weight, and one day I'll be skinny, but you'll never have hair. And there was a mean spirit to them, to that whole interchange, that when I talked earlier about, like, I didn't like that because it's sort of peeked too far behind the curtain. Like, I'm happy to have the bickering on when you're doing the show, but I don't want to know that you guys dislike each other.
Yeah, it was sort of like reality television playing out. Like, everyone loves to see the conflict on Real Housewives. You were watching these two men who were sniping at each other viciously, but also had a friendship. It was just, it's a weird alchemy I can't quite capture, but you got to see some of these clips.
But it did come back when Siskel died, and Ebert had such laudatory things, such lovely things to say about his friend, that it really did make you feel better about the whole thing.
And even in that Joan Rivers clip, when he said, I'm just a better reviewer than Roger Ebert, he softened it a few moments later by saying anyone who reads an Ebert review would find it, quote, extremely well written. So they had this back and forth that they maintained throughout, and they were able to be professional while also being highly entertaining. And choosing the final word for this podcast is often a complicated task. Sometimes a figure is so larger than life that it feels only appropriate to end things with a pithy quote or some words that have become more deeply resonant with the passage of time. Other situations call for the words of an outside observer. Sometimes a relative or a loved one can provide some meaningful insight about the subject, while other situations call for someone intimately familiar with the person, like a biographer or close friend. But with Gene Siskel, the choice was obvious. Perhaps no other person we've covered on Last Days has been so closely associated with another person that it feels oddly incomplete to say one name without the other. Siskel and Ebert will be forever etched in the public's memory as a duo who could communicate volumes with just a turn of their thumbs. And so I thought it only fitting to give Roger Ebert the final word in his touching remembrance of Siskel more than a decade after he passed, eloquently describing why what they did worked so well. He wrote, quote, "Gene Siskel and I were like tuning forks. Strike one and the other would pick up the same frequency. When we were in a group together, we were always intensely aware of one another. Sometimes this took the form of camaraderie, sometimes shared opinions, sometimes hostility. But we were aware. If something happened that we both thought was funny, but weren't supposed to, God help us if one caught the other's eye. We almost always thought the same things were funny. That may be the best sign of intellectual communion."